Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
I am fantastic. We may have stumbled upon a conspiracy theory, which we get to explore later in the show. Really looking forward to that. It's a it's a good time. It's a good time to be a Vikings fan. It's a good time to have access to the internet. God bless them internets. Well, welcome to the show. We've got a bunch of cool stuff to talk about. We are going to discuss the victory over the Seahawks, so that the Vikings are now 2-0 in the preseason. You just don't beat Mike Zimmer in an early preseason game. You just don't.
You can't do it.
Nope, you just can't do it. We're also going to discuss a little bit about kicker stuff, and if any of that is resolved or if it's still clear as mud. Talk about who's on the bubble, and we will be previewing the Arizona game coming up on, I believe that's Saturday, and we will be looking at Detroit, which is just full of people who enjoy following their team and aren't creating conspiracy theories about their quarterback's back injury at all. Not
correct.
Not
an accurate assessment of the situation.
Not at all. No one is doing a darn thing there. So that's all to come. But just want to thank you guys so much for listening and for helping out. If you enjoy the show, if you hear value in what we produce, you can feel free to make a donation. You can go to paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and become a donor there. That's more of a subscription-based thing, like an NPR drive. So it ends up going, $1 a month, tree fitty, to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. Just whatever you'd like to do really helps keep the lights on, helps keep us ad-free, and helps keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. These things are important. These things add up. We do have a couple of donations to discuss this week. We do have a new Patreon subscriber in the name of Jack. Thank you, Jack, so much. Really do appreciate that. We also have 2 PayPal donations to go over. The first is from, and apologies when I destroy your name here, Ayush Maski. Yeah, let's go with that. Who says, "Aloha from Hawaii." Thank you. Thank you so very much for helping out there. Also, we have something from Kirk Lindgren. I did notice an uptick in donations this week that had something to do, and emails to the show that had something to do with bribes for the fantasy league.
Don't know what they're talking about.
No, not a clue at all. No. No donations that were brought in were received and then considered in the random drawing for places in the fantasy league. I want to make that clear. We've always been in a land war with Asia. But
sorry, Eurasia.
There we go. Thank you. But just wanted to mention here from Kirk Lindgren, I owe this to you guys anyway for all of your amazing coverage, but let's also consider this a bribe for the fantasy league too. So yeah, I actually didn't check to see if he was in, which is also to say that all people who are involved in the fantasy league have been contacted. They were emailed today, and then the alternates were also emailed. And in the case of one of them, I put her on both lists because apparently I'm a moron. So everyone involved has been notified. Thank you all for donating your time, energy, and let's say, no, this is really just an investment in your future, because you're probably too happy if you want to be involved in this, and you need to be knocked down a few pegs, and this league will help you with that. So, but everyone has been contacted that is involved with it. The real winners are those who did not get selected. So please enjoy the rest of your fantasy league.
Congrats to all of you.
Yeah, as I said on Twitter, yes, like the real congrats is to those who did not end up making it. Enjoy not being a part of this insanity. So, but everyone has been contacted who should be involved in fantasy. So all of that aside, again, thank you guys so much for listening. If you would like to help out the show and would not like to donate or do not have anything to send our way and to help us out, feel free to retweet the messages about episodes coming out, share it on social media, tell a friend about Norse Code, do whatever you got to do. But we are entering the regular season here really soon, and that will mean 2 episodes a week. Usually the beginning of the week will be the recap episode of the prior game, and then later we will have the regular episode in which we break down the game, usually with a special guest, and all that. So we are looking at increasing the number of episodes per week to 2, so you can look forward to that coming in September. All things aside, let's get into the actual episode itself, shall we? The Vikings won over Seattle, and the big story that seems to be coming out of it is has nothing to do with the running backs. It has everything to do with the backup quarterback situation. And Mike Zimmer has said a lot of things about Kyle Sloter that while he's been playing great, it seems to me from reading his comments that Zimmer has more of a problem with Sloter in the office and the way that he kind of behaves in the locker room, as instead of like how he's actually playing.
Well, not so much that. It's still like on-field stuff, but it's not making the appropriate checks, getting into the right formation, making sure that they're running the correct play, audibling out of bad looks and stuff like that, which is a problem I identified him having last year. Based off of, I mean, and typically it's actually a difficult problem for someone like me to diagnose, but it was pretty obvious that he wasn't adjusting plays in response to obvious blitz looks and getting a little bit lucky. Now, obviously, his preseason numbers are good again. And, that brings up the question, why isn't he quarterback 2? Is Zimmer just being obstinate? Is it because he's a young player and they brought in a veteran? And I think it's not really that. Like, Zimmer was very clear throughout the offseason that they really wanted to bring in a veteran. And this is kind of why. I know somebody, tweeted at me like, well, if this is what he can do, if he doesn't have all of that figured out, then imagine, what he could do with better players around him, or why wouldn't you promote him to quarterback 2 to see what happens? And while I do think that there's value in having him play with the 2s, I'm not saying that that's not the case. I don't think that it would test the appropriate things that you need to be testing for Kyle Sloter. So the problem with the snaps that we've seen is that it kind of tests his ability to throw the ball after kind of reading the defense right away, and not all of this other stuff, audibling out of plays and checking into the right formations and stuff like that. And that doesn't really get tested all that well, especially with the 3s, because you're seeing a bunch of vanilla defenses. And so while some types of difficulty kind of ramp up proportional to the level of talent on the field, like, maybe the windows get kind of smaller, the further up the depth chart you go and you play against the 1s, maybe, you need to get the ball out a little bit quicker, against the 1s, like that might increase proportional to the changes in talent level. The other things kind of don't, because you're more likely to see, odd blitz looks or stuff that'll challenge your protection schemes in a different way. You'll see unique coverages, where your defensive lineman is dropping off into coverage, and that allows kind of a safety to move up from deep and stuff like that. And that is stuff that you would need to be kind of fixing pre-snap and getting your offense kind of in the right place for you to anticipate appropriately and respond. And that does not increase proportionally. That'll increase, exponentially, for the lack of a better word. So that increases the difficulty several times. And I don't think that because he played well without that, that's a sign that, he could be so good, because once he grasps that, he's got, kind of both sides of the equation. That's not really fair to the other parts of quarterbacking and players that have kind of mastered that, because those are not the things that we get to see tested in the preseason. So it wasn't that he put himself at a disadvantage on the field against the 3s when he wasn't checking out of looks, although he kind of did a little bit because, he's not checking out of blitzes and stuff like that. But it's that we didn't get to see them really have consequences in when he was in with the 3s. And that's, I think, really significant, because we see situations where he should be doing it, he doesn't do it, and then he executes the throw and it looks pretty good. And so, he can play kind of like with an arm tied behind his back. Wow, that's pretty fascinating. But what's really happening is that he's not being punished for it by the nature of the preseason. And as you kind of move forward and you kind of move up the depth chart and you see the 1s versus the 2s versus the 3s, you'll see the kind of quote unquote punishment for that increase very dramatically. And so I mean, that's pretty huge. You need to be able to get into the right play. Quarterbacks are supposed to be pretty cerebral, and that's kind of a big part of kind of the brain power aspect of quarterbacking. So I think that deserves a lot more weight than it gets. And I think that people kind of complaining that he should get a shot at quarterback 2 after hearing that criticism from Zimmer, I think just kind of are underappreciating that aspect of quarterback play and just kind of assume that as talent level rises up the depth chart, so do these other types of difficulty associated with quarterbacking. That's not really the case. He's much more likely to be punished. Like, for example, the pick 6 that Sean Mannion threw, which I don't think was on Mannion. I do think it was on BB. You can kind of probably argue it in a couple of different ways, but I think that's primarily on BB. The pick 6 that he threw was a product of coverage confusion. So BB thought that he was in zone coverage because he saw the linebacker, probably. But he was in man coverage, and so he should have kept running. And Mannion, who has a better view of the field, sees that it's man coverage, so he throws as if he's still running. That coverage was kind of confusing to diagnose, and that's why BB kind of dialed down. That's maybe not that specific play. Maybe Kyle Sloter doesn't throw that specific pick 6, but that's the type of play that he'll be victim to the further up the depth chart you go. And so I don't really think it's fair to say, hey, we know that this player is not very good at this. Let's move him up anyway. Because that's not fair to the rest of the second team offense. It's not just the Kyle Sloter show. Sorry, Don. We're not just trying to evaluate how he plays. You're trying to evaluate how all 10 other players on the field play. And if you're not giving them a quarterback that can kind of put them in that situation, imagine if because of this, and I wouldn't say that this is the natural result, but imagine if because of this, Sloter's not calling the right protections, and so the left tackle crashes down on the defensive tackle instead of taking on the defensive end or blitzing linebacker. That left tackle ends up looking bad. Now, obviously, the coaches will be able to account for that, but that means we don't get that rep. We don't get to see how the left tackle would do against that linebacker, against that defensive end in that protection, and that just robs him of an opportunity to prove himself. So, too, with receivers that might be reading the defense correctly and throttling down or changing the route, and Kyle Sloter throwing a different route instead. We don't get to see how that receiver does at the catch point. So yeah, the receiver won't be docked by the coaches, but that receiver also doesn't have the ability to show off the things that they can do. And so it's not fair to them either. So I don't think you should just promote Kyle Sloter to see if maybe this trial by fire, or if you can overcome this deficiency or whatever and still produce, because these are the things that from a traits perspective, you can project not translating well as you kind of move up. And the coaches are kind of doing their due diligence saying, hey, these traits don't translate into a direct backup. They don't translate into somebody you can just slip into a game. And so we're going to keep on working with this player to make sure that they have that. And you don't need necessarily to put up like stats and stuff like that to be able to prove that, because the coaches, they don't evaluate based off of the box score, obviously. And I don't honestly think that they should. I talk about the importance of analytics and statistics all the time when it comes to player evaluation, but I think that's a lot less important when we talk about coaches, and to some extent, although significantly less, general managers. I think coaches should be evaluating what they're coaching and seeing if the player is executing that. And part of their evaluation is not, did he make the throw, but did he get into the right play? Because that's going to be important going forward. So I think the pushback on this is just way too much. That said, I think Sean Mannion did well. I mean, he didn't throw as well as Kyle Sloter. If you get rid of that pick 6, which again, I don't think is his fault, he performed well enough. I mean, his yards per attempt wasn't great. His accuracy was okay. He has a strong arm, so it's not as if he can't make those deep throws. But he did well enough, and he led a touchdown drive. So I'm not that concerned with how he played. Sloter obviously played, quote unquote, better, but I don't think that Mannion's play in the preseason game is anything to be too concerned about. I've been very concerned with how Kyle Sloter has practiced. I've been very concerned with how Sean Mannion has practiced. But at least Mannion is checking into the right plays. And if we're going to dismiss concerns about how players play in practice, there's no reason to be alarmed by what Sean Mannion did.
So I guess the big thing that's happening now, it seems, is that people are kind of ignoring how Sean Mannion played, and there seems to be a bit of an uprising in the whole, why isn't Sloter number 2? Why isn't Sloter number 2? And it really just breaks down into, like you said, it breaks down into a practice situation, and it breaks down into Sean Mannion hasn't been playing terrible. Admittedly, he didn't have a great first preseason game, but he seemed serviceable in the second.
Yeah, and that's what I would say would be a reason to kind of tone down. Now, I think if you put all statistics together, even if you get rid of that one interception, his total preseason statistics don't look great, right? And it's something to be kind of broadly concerned about, but I don't know that Sloter would perform better than Mannion during the regular season. When you get rid of vanilla defenses and those tertiary quarterback skills become significantly more important. The Mannion game was fine. I would say that there's reason to be kind of broadly, upset if the Vikings don't find a way to improve the quarterback situation, the backup quarterback situation, kind of in the long term. But Mannion as your backup going into the season, that's not ideal, but it's not catastrophic. It's not like you've got Joe Webb and the Vikings refuse to call read option bad.
I mean, it could be worse. You could be in a situation where Paxton Lynch is on your roster.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Like
that did not look
way
good.
Worse. That was awful. It's hard to throw a 54 passer rating without also throwing an interception.
Yeah.
That's incredible to me.
True or false, we lose this game if Paxton Lynch was competent.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, it was a pretty close game, so yeah.
He did not have a good game. But we saw the Viking starters. Viking starters did fairly well. Kirk Cousins and Thielen had a real nice hookup again, and Diggs got involved and everything. Was there anything that was a bit of a surprise as far as the offense is concerned and the offensive starters?
I would say the fact that they continued throwing deep is a bit of a surprise, which I don't know, maybe that's unfair, but
maybe they just really wanted to show off, like, oh yeah, we're just going to keep doing this to Adam Thielen.
Right. Yeah. So this is interesting. So preseason last year, Diggs gets the lion's share of targets. Practice and preseason last year, concerns about chemistry with Adam Thielen. Preseason this year, Diggs has like 2 targets for like 12 yards or something like that. And Adam Thielen's getting all these deep shots. Hopefully, we'll see Diggs kind of more heavily involved in the offense when the season actually starts. And I wouldn't be surprised if they've got some plans for Diggs because, he's a very good player that has kind of a unique skill set. So, maybe they've got kind of plans for what they're going to do with Diggs that they're not revealing in the preseason. Maybe I'm just being hopeful, but he was destroying corners in practice. I think Xavier Rhodes had his best preseason in a while. And despite that, I think Diggs did a number on him. So I think it's pretty clear that they're going to involve him more in the offense going forward. But instead, we get this underneath route to him in the red zone, and that's kind of all we get. I'll say, I liked the use of, wide receiver sweeps and so on. I liked that the run game, it wasn't great with Madison in there aside from the one run, but it generally, I think, showcases the potential that run game can provide. I think the bounce back to the outside on the 22-yard run, I think it takes a little bit more talent and vision than people are giving him credit for. And so, because that run was supposed to go to the right knee, and he bounces out to the left, and I think that was a good move. But there's some concern. I think without that, he averages under 3 yards a carry. So that's kind of worth looking into. It was a very bad game for Pat Elflein. A lot of people are talking about it now. Mixed reviews for Garrett Bradbury. And I would say, a pretty good game from Josh Klein. And of course, people are pretty excited about the limited number of pressures and the complete lack of sacks. That's great. Not because necessarily the offensive line themselves did well in pass protection, but because the Vikings kind of moved the pocket, got rid of the ball quickly, and so on. So they're finding ways to protect Cousins that don't just rely on the offensive line itself.
And I suppose the bigger, another thing that came out of it was that Cook didn't play. Cook did not play a single down, and instead we were treated to the number 2, number 3, and number 4 running backs.
Yeah, I don't think we expected Cook to have that much involvement, but I wouldn't have been surprised to see a little bit. In fact, I had a little bit of a side bet going on with somebody else that Cook would see at least one snap, not necessarily carry the ball, but would see at least one snap. And he was warming up before the game. I had my eyes on him, and he acted like he was going to play. And then they call the starters out, and Cook is on the sidelines looking kind of ticked off. And I'm just like so upset because I'm pretty confident that they were going to, and then decided against it for whatever reason. Which is very annoying to me because I ended up losing the bet. But in terms of concerns, I'm not that concerned. I don't think that there's like an injury re-injury risk. I think they just kind of scared themselves out of it.
Well, the preseason doesn't have a regular schedule or something where it's the same game on the same day. So that could be a thing, is that you're trying to protect your player from. Sorry, I was channeling my Matt Patricia. We'll get into that later. The Vikings defense also showed up for their starters. How did you feel they played? I was a little underwhelmed, mainly because the Vikings just always have trouble with running quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, they got worked by Taysom Hill last week, right? I don't think it was too bad. I know that there were some runs to Everson Griffin's side that weren't shut down. I think actually Griffin did an all right job, and it was really the responsibility of the alley player, usually a cornerback, to kind of shut some of that stuff down. And that didn't work out. But I think that, we saw some positives from Jalen Holmes. Hercules maybe didn't have as strong of a game, but he wasn't with the one, so easy to kind of just ignore that for now. But it's difficult to kind of evaluate kind of what's happening up front without Linval Joseph there. But I'd say Daniil Hunter had a great game. Jalen Holmes had a pretty good game. Everson, I think, had a better game than his kind of statistics would imply. I think he had something like 2 tackles or something like that. But I thought he, held the edge well. And then at linebacker, typically with a running quarterback, your concerns are what's happening with the linebacker. That's who got toasted against Taysom Hill. But I'd say Anthony Barr generally had a pretty good game. Eric Kendricks was all right, and Ben Gedeon for the snaps that he was in on, which, base downs with the first team, and then he was also with the second team as one of the nickel linebackers. I thought Ben Gedeon had a pretty good game. And then at the back end, the only real issue was the 33-yard pass that was between Anthony Harris and Mackenzie Alexander. And I think a lot of people initially put that on Mackenzie Alexander, and I think that that's kind of fair, but I think what ended up happening was that both Mack and Waynes had the underneath player, and Anthony Harris had, it was, I think, a 2-shell or a 2-deep shell, and I think that was Harris's responsibility, but honestly, it was just a route run at the exact right depth to create that confusion. But it was on Harrison, so that's, a little bit of a concern. But on the other hand, we saw Harrison Smith, he had a great play, and just generally, I thought, did really well. So, I would say that the defense looked all right. I think that on those running plays, that's a concern. They got to drill down on it if the quarterback is a threat to keep. But I would say just from a general perspective, it's more good than bad from the first team.
Yeah. Let's go with the main battles that we've been looking at this whole camp. Especially now that camp is basically done. Let's look at the wide receiver 3, and did anyone really stand out?
Yeah, wide receiver. I don't think anyone in the preseason really stood out for the wide receiver 3 battle. In theory, if Treadwell is in the battle, right, 4 for 47. Brandon Zylstra had a good game, and so you could say he kind of made the case for himself. But we're taking a look at like BC Johnson, who had 1 target, no receptions. We're taking a look at Chad Beebe, who had 2 targets and 1 reception. and they might be kind of the most likely candidates. If Zylstra can continue to prove that he's worthy of targets and worthy of more time, then maybe he can kind of work his way back into the wide receiver 3 discussion. He hasn't done that yet, and he's kind of the closest to it. But I don't think we saw a ton from BB. Badette maybe is another name to throw in there, or BC Johnson to kind of change what happened. So BB's still the presumptive wide receiver 3, but it wasn't because of a particularly strong game from him. It was more the legitimate candidates for that position didn't really show out like some of them did last week.
Which leads me to talk about Laquan Treadwell. And it seemed like, and I forget if this was a line from the presser or not, that the Vikings were trying to feature Laquan Treadwell and all that he could do in a bit of like of an infomercial sort of thing. Like, look, he can catch the ball. Look, he can run with the ball. You guys should trade for him, right? Right. Giants, we're looking at you.
Yeah, Zimmer used the word, we were trying to showcase him a little bit, I guess. That was the phrase. That was interesting to hear. Showcase can mean a couple of things, but I think the most obvious one is to showcase a product for sale, right? And so it very much seems like the Vikings are trying to demonstrate that he's, worthy of trading. And, we saw some breaking news, I think, from an NFL Network person that maybe Albert Breer, that the Vikings are trying to trade Laquan Treadwell. I would say they've been trying to trade him since the combine and haven't gotten any takers. They're trying to gin up a trade market for a player that doesn't have a ton of value in a market. It's interesting to me, but I don't want to say don't read too much into it, mostly because I don't expect there to be a trade partner. I think it's very clear that the Vikings want to trade him, and I think Zimmer kind of laid it out.
Yeah, let's go with that. That seems, it's not weird at all. Why would this be odd?
Absolutely not trying to trade Percy Harvin.
No, absolutely not. Nothing of the sort. So I guess another thing that we could talk about is, we can talk about running back. We did see everyone but Cook end up playing, and there's still the question about who ends up being the number 2 or number 3 running back rather. Matheson's job to lose?
Yeah, I would say it's Madison's job to lose. He didn't necessarily play well. I wouldn't necessarily blame him either for like his low yards per carry. But he didn't show out. He had 1 pass protection rep. He did a great job on it, so that's good to see. It was kind of weird. It was a cut block, which Zimmer was just talking last week about. Madison's just got more capability and potential in pass protection because he's a bigger body, and like a cut block does not require. It's very often the technique you use if you are a smaller body attempting to slow things down in pass protection. But whatever. Seemed fine, didn't seem to do anything that it would indicate it's his job to lose. I think Mike Boone made a great case for himself again as running back 3. He earned, I think, more yards per carry. It wasn't actually a remarkable yards per carry. In fact, Madison had a longer gain, the longest gain, I think, of any rusher on either side of the ball in the game, including Mike Boone. But we remember, Mike Boone has the ability to kind of break out these big plays. And while he struggled, I think, to generate much yardage, again, I'm not confident that all of it's his fault. He did generate some pretty good chunks of yard when Seattle knew he was going to run the ball when the Vikings were in kill the clock mode. He just kept on churning out extra yards. So that was good to see. And I think that he's got, a really rock solid argument to be the 3rd running back, because I don't think, Abdullah by not playing only hurt his case. I think that's kind of how the running back situation plays down. I think in terms of the fullback stuff, we got to see a better game from CJ Ham this week than last week. So that, that's good if the Vikings stick with CJ Ham. They've got somebody who has the capacity to kind of take some bad games, put it behind him. Blassingham, I think, as a blocker didn't look nearly as good, which is unfortunate because he's my guy. But, he still performed as a ball carrier and as a receiver. And so he just provides more options. as a fullback than CJ Ham does. So it'll be kind of interesting because it's two different styles of fullback. They're competing against each other. Who knows?
Yeah, and we could have some discount Ham if he ends up if Blassingham ends up getting the position. So the last thing I want to ask about is the corner battle. Has that managed to kind of solidify it all?
I don't think so. I think some people were asking, hey, did Holton Hill kick himself off the team with that penalty? And A, I mean, obviously it hasn't happened yet, right? Because we're recording this and he's still on the team. But B, Zimmer just didn't seem all that upset with the penalty, right? Like after the game in the presser,
he gets upset about dumb pendays, and he didn't get.
He told into Laquan Treadwell for the blindside block last week. Right. And then this penalty happens and he's like, well, you never want to see a player injured and, that's a penalty. But I mean, if you're going to run the quarterback, expect this to happen. It was like, wait, what? Okay. That's kind of a weird alternate defense of admittedly a late sliding quarterback, but a sliding quarterback getting knocked in the head by a helmet. That's obviously a penalty and obviously a dumb, bad one. Okay, fine. If you're not going to tear into him after you tore into him all offseason, sure. So he really just didn't care. So I think Holton Hill, when he comes back from suspension halfway through the season, is very clearly cornerback 5 behind Mike Hughes. But I mean, he's been remarkable in camp. He's probably not as good in run defense as you'd want from a cornerback like Trey Waynes is, but I don't really care that much. He's been really phenomenal in coverage, and he was good in coverage in this game too. So not something I'm super worried about. I think beyond that, there's not really a ton of answers, right? So Mike Hughes coming back from injury. I don't think he's going to start the season on the PUP list. I think he's going to be probably injured for the first couple of weeks of the season, but he's going to be ready before week 6, which is why I don't want him on the PUP list. But, Mike Hughes coming back from injury, that's going to be good. But between Mike Hughes and Holton Hill, if you don't have either of them, which is certainly a possibility for the first couple of weeks, you're left with Chris Boyd, who got one special team snap and didn't get any snaps on defense. You're left with Duke Thomas, who's been playing kind of abysmally throughout camp. You're left with Bene Ben-Wickery, who at least has gotten better over the past couple of days. I would say, it's good he didn't get absolutely burned. But, it's not like Craig James was last in the rotation. I don't think he's like a serious threat to make the team yet. I'm not heartened by it. I mean, Duke Thomas had a better game than we're used to seeing, but it's just not a good group.
Well, who's on the bubble? Let's talk bubble players now that training camp is finished up. Who is on the bubble, and who do you think is going to end up making it to the final round of cuts?
Yeah, well, we can go through by position group and still make it pretty fast. So I'd say along the defensive line, I think your 9 are probably locked in with Shamar Lindvall and Everson and Daniil, and then your 2 defensive tackles. Then also Afadi, who's been playing really well, Stephen Weatherly, who hasn't been as good, but has been fine. And then I think beyond that, I think nose tackle / 3 technique. I think you might be able to play both. You've got Armon Watts, who has been playing really well in the preseason, played really well in the early portion of camp, didn't really kind of follow that up necessarily in the back end of camp, but is showing up in the preseason, so kind of all is forgiven from that perspective. I thought he had a really good game. He had put a lot of pressure on the quarterback. He was able to clog up running lanes, redirect running backs, really good stuff. So he's on the bubble. He's somebody to kind of watch for if they have 10 defensive linemen, which I don't think they will. He'd be a great 10th. Carter Schultz, I think, is a practice squad guy. He had a phenomenal game. Oh, my God. It's as if he was playing against AAF players or something. He did a really good job, even in run defense. It's just his arms are so short, and it's so obvious. He was just outside of tackle radius on a bunch of these plays. He still forced running backs to move and stuff like that, but it would have been nice to see him just produce a little bit more. Of course, as soon as I tweet that out, he gets a tackle behind the line of scrimmage, so he seems to find ways to just do stuff. At linebacker, both Cameron Smith and Rashard Cliet have impressed me so far this camp. I would say Cameron Smith had a better game than Cliet did. I think Cliet had some issues in run defense, and Cameron Smith overall had a fine 13 or so snaps, and his place on the second team has been kind of solidified. So he's kind of moved up a little bit on the depth chart. They're bubble guys that are going to be kind of interesting to watch. I personally had both of them making the team, but I could see either of them kind of being a very tough cut for the Vikings to make. And then I think offensively, your bubble players include Zylstra, who had a good game, Badette, who didn't have a ton receiving, had one rushing snap, which was fine for 10 yards, played on special teams. Zimmer mentioned that he kind of missed an opportunity on special teams, but otherwise did a pretty good job as a returner. So he's kind of somebody to watch for on the bubble. I'd say Blassingham is on the bubble. Hopefully you can run block a little bit better going forward. Dakota Dozier, I'd say, is on the bubble, and he had a really good game at left tackle, even though he's considered a guard in the NFL. He played left tackle in college. Let's say for Furman, the Furman Paladins or something like that. So that's somebody to kind of watch for. Danny Isidore is on the bubble. I would say he played very poorly, especially in pass protection. I think he's kind of on the outside looking in. Oli Udoh had another really good game. He's kind of a player that's not really playing with very good technique. He's the kind of player that, kind of like Kyle Sloter, where if you move him up the depth chart, I think his weaknesses will get exposed in a way that it's not really happening on the third team. So he's somebody I wouldn't say is like set to go at right tackle as a backup. But, that's something I think that is worth saying. Drew Samia, he keeps on flashing some good stuff, especially at the second level, and he keeps on having deservedly bad PFF grades. It's really interesting. He got pushed back a ton when he was lined up over a tackle in the run game, and you can't do that. He has to probably sit a year and add strength. But I would say the stuff that he's flashed, his scoop blocks are great. His second level stuff is pretty good. His pass protection is not bad, actually. It's really just run blocking and really only when he's lined head up over somebody where you're kind of concerned. But, you could consider him a bubble player, even though fourth round picks typically don't get cut unless they're Willie Beavers. Storm Norton had a bad game. I'd say he's on the bubble, but I think he's also on the outside looking in. I think the Vikings are very much looking for Avion, I think is the pronunciation now, to come back. People are pretty upset at Rashad Hill. I'm not sure why. He actually had a pretty good game, and I think outside of the penalties last week, it wasn't a bad game. He's playing better against starters than most backups would, so he's fine. But if you want to consider him a bubble player, then I would say he improved his chances. But yeah, that's kind of, and Brett Jones looked great. So that's kind of, I guess Kyle Sloter's a bubble player. I always just assume the Vikings are going to keep three quarterbacks, and so I don't really consider him a bubble player. But that's something to consider. And then of course I already mentioned Zylstra looking really good, and then Jordan Taylor I think is off the roster. I mean, he's not even showing up with the twos, so it's too bad for him. Oh, and tight ends, I don't think you find a way to keep Dillon or Hicatini, but both looked fantastic. Again, this is the best the fourth and fifth tight ends have looked for the Vikings in a long, long time.
So the Arizona game is coming up. We can transition to the Arizona game, and I've had the unfortunate occurrence of watching a fair amount of the Arizona stuff this preseason,
Rough.
And boy, that offense looks like a gigantic mess.
Yeah, it feels like something that's it's not going to look good until it just clicks.
Yeah, it really does have that like baby giraffe's first step thing going on.
Yeah.
Like Murray's not bad, but I don't understand what the hell he's doing. Like,
yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's like he's not playing terribly. You just don't know what you just don't know what he's actually trying to do. Maybe it's just a situation of not being comfortable in the offense quite yet, or they're asking him to do too much. But man, I
wouldn't be surprised if that's part of it. And I also wouldn't be surprised if he's just getting taken out of his game by the fact that he can't false clap. Like that's gotta like mess with your rhythm a little bit.
Well, but, I mean, when you're that short and playing quarterback, I mean,
right?
Height truthers.
Yeah, I would say the Arizona game can still present tests even on offense. So for some reason, Larry Fitzgerald plays in the preseason. Fine. He'll obviously be an appropriate test, especially for Mackenzie Alexander. I expect to see Christian Kirk mixed in a little bit with the ones because I think he's, kind of their slot guy. And then for some reason, Kevin White is listed as their starter outside receiver. He didn't play any snaps last game, and they had like Darrell Daniels play receiver officially listed on. He's like their fifth tight end or something. But you'll see Damiere Byrd and you'll see Keyshawn Johnson, not that Keyshawn Johnson,
not the Keyshawn Johnson.
Right. Which, I mean, let's be clear, it's not as if like his mother wasn't aware. But there's tests there, right? I don't know if we're going to see Kevin White. I know that Andy Isabella was kind of, there was some worry about whether or not he would play in week 2, and he did because he's coming off of an injury. But there's some decent tests at wide receiver. I would say, Keyshawn Johnson, who's been kind of blowing up camp, he overtook Hakeem Butler, who will not be in this game because he might even be on IR because of a fractured hand. I would say that Keyshawn Johnson is kind of an underrated threat to the Vikings have to test themselves against. And so he might do some damage against the 2s and 3s. So that's kind of what you're looking at from that perspective. On the offensive line, they are better than last year. It's hard to get worse. They are better than last year, especially the addition of Marcus Gilbert at right tackle. So we're going to see Daniel Hunter go up against like a legitimate right tackle. So that's going to be good to see. Center AQ Shipley, fine. Left tackle DJ Humphreys. If Everson doesn't produce against him, then you've got problems. But I think for now, it's not going to be a great test of what the starters will do on that side of the line. J.R. Sweezy, not that impressed with him. Now, they do have guard Justin Pugh, who has been missing, injured. I think he's cleared for preseason week 3. We'll see. And then at tight end, I think Charles Clay, there's a chance he could play in week 3, and he didn't play in week 2, and he's had like kind of a history of knee injuries. So that, I think, provides some appropriate tests. Their starting tight end, Ricky Seals-Jones, outside of Charles Clay, is not a huge threat. Defensively, it's going to be kind of interesting. Last week we did see Patrick Peterson play, so I expect to see him play. DJ Swearinger has kind of revived his career a little bit after struggling in Houston. He went up to Washington, did well, and now he's doing all right in the preseason here. I guess he's not doing great in coverage, but he's good in run defense. Buda Baker, who went to the Pro Bowl as a special teamer, is also kind of a talent that could be worth evaluating. The problem is, of course, Robert Alford is on IR because of a pretty gruesome injury. And so if Cousins only tests Robert Alford's backup, who might be, I doubt it's Tremaine Brock. It might be like Brandon Williams, who was just awful last year, who didn't play last week. Could be Byron Murphy, the rookie, who I think is meant to be their nickel guy. That won't be a great test for Thielen or Diggs, but hopefully you can take advantage of some weaknesses in the roster. And then at linebacker, not counting the edge players, Chandler Jones and Terrell Suggs, who are going to be interesting tests for the offensive line. I wouldn't say I'm super excited about who they've got at linebacker, so I don't, unless Hassan Reddick plays, I don't think that they're going to provide a great test in run blocking. And then along the defensive line, you've got like rookie Zach Allen, who was drafted in the 3rd round. A lot of people saw him as a first rounder. He'll be interesting. They've been trying to sign a defensive tackle, and they didn't. So I don't know if they intend to replace Zach Allen as the starter or what. But they had an injury there, so it might just be kind of a replacement there. But I'm not overly impressed with what they have on the defensive line either. So it's really, they've got some strengths in some places and some weaknesses in others. Which is for a team, I guess.
Yeah, their preseason games have not looked good. They have not been.
No, the Raiders tore them apart, and we don't really have a high opinion of the Raiders.
No, not in the least, actually. But yeah, it's just they are a mess, and I look forward to seeing if they end up kind of picking themselves up and dusting themselves off, or if they just decide to go further into the muck. Be interesting. Speaking of further into the muck, let's look at Detroit. In our 3-part series of looking at the division, we'll go to Detroit, and instead of starting off by talking about their new tight end or the fact that they appear to have lost one of their running backs for the year, ignoring all of these things, do you want to go into some conspiracy theory stuff?
Do I want to go into some conspiracy? James.
Oh, this is good. So I would say I got an anonymous tip. It wasn't as anonymous. I've known the guy for years, but I got a message from my resident Lions fan from Michigan who said that there is a conspiracy theory going on that Matt Stafford is hiding, and the Lions are hiding a gnarly back injury from last year that didn't heal.
Gnarly
back injury. So you start to look into it, okay, and there are certainly a lot of posts about it, and they are starting to outright deny it. However, he's not playing right now. So you start to wonder, how deep does this rabbit hole go? Well, Stafford himself has said that his arm is fine, which nobody was asking really what was going on with his arm. But, you know, it's interesting. So I want to read a quote, and admittedly, it's a long quote from Matt Patricia, head coach of the Lions. And the article is from Detroit Sports Nation, the headline being Detroit Lions head coach Matt Patricia reveals why Matt Stafford is not practicing. So he was asked if this had anything to do with like a pitch count or anything for his quarterback. And he said, yeah, normal question, fine. If somebody's coming back from a little bit of an injury, and they disclosed a back injury for Stafford last year, at the very end of the year, but he said, quote, I don't really do the pitch count thing, Patricia said. I know a lot of people like to do stories about their quarterbacks and the pitch count in baseball, but I'm not a baseball guy. I think for me, it's really just a feel thing as far as I'm having the game on Saturday. You really got to think about the games and the practice weeks that we have and what's leading up to it. What's different about the preseason is that you can really get into some unusual weeks. Game on Thursday, then Saturday, then Friday, then Thursday on a short week. Now, we know the fourth one, when that is, and then get ready for the regular season. Some of the patterns are just different than they would be normally during the regular season. So it's kind of just weird, sort of weekly schedule, where in the regular season, it is what it is. You just have to prepare and go normal. But where we can maybe control some of that in the preseason, we always look at those options. What the hell was that?
Tell us anything.
I learned a couple things here. First things first, he's not a baseball person.
Great.
Second off, even if he was a baseball person, Stafford is not on a pitch count, despite the fact he hasn't played in any of the preseason.
Yeah, he's not on a pitch count, but we are careful about whether or not he practices or plays. Come on, man.
I mean, is this the sort of thing that Patricia is like, I got kids at home and school starts next week, so we got to get their like bed schedule right now so they'll be okay when it comes to the regular season. Like, is that what's going on here?
Right. I don't understand it.
And it's not like every game during the regular season is on Sunday. You know, there's Thursday stuff. I know for a fact there's a Thursday game for the Lions because they always play on Thanksgiving. So, like,
it doesn't make any sense.
No, this is the Chewbacca. He just Chewbacca defensed us. Matt Patricia just Chewbacca defensed us. Look at the monkey. Look at the shiny monkey. It doesn't make sense. You got a game on Thursday, then Saturday, then Friday, then Thursday on a short week. Now we know the fourth one, when that is, and when you got to get ready for the regular season. Some of the patterns are just different than they would be normally during the regular season.
So he doesn't practice.
What? No, I love that This is the new Andrew Luck situation, which is great because Andrew Luck is having another Andrew Luck situation.
Right.
We have always been at war with Eurasia. Let us be clear. This is just what we do now. Oh, this is so fantastic. And it goes deeper. Like the headline, "You be the judge. Are the Lions covering up a Matthew Stafford injury?"
The headlines are so great. Matthew Stafford insists he doesn't have a back, and like, oh, okay. Must you insist so?
Matt Stafford didn't do any team drills at practice today, was told it was just, quote, a rest. Asked him if his arm was fine on the way out the field, and he said, oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Why would you ask?
Why would this be weird? This is so fantastic. I can't wait for the Lions to end up just trading Matt Stafford out and being like, we can no longer afford the mediocrity of it. We need to move on to something newer and less expensive. And then he ends up on like the Chiefs. Maybe not the Chiefs. Chiefs would be the example I was thinking of, but like ends up on like the Cardinals or something and has a full Alex Smith on the Chiefs like revitalization.
That would be incredible.
You're like all of a sudden, yeah, that'd be like, oh, he's tossing for 5,000 yards and all of a sudden has receivers and all this. Like, I'm just waiting for that sort of thing. So, yeah, the Lions may or may not be covering up for a Matt Stafford injury. I suppose we'll find out in week 1 when Stafford's supposed to be playing, and they end up starting their backup quarterback, who I'm totally not Googling right now.
David Fales?
Maybe.
He's a divisional acquisition. He previously played for Chicago.
I love the headline. I searched for Detroit Lions backup quarterback. Detroit Free Press 5 hours ago. Detroit Lions backup quarterback situation may be the worst in the NFL. This is fantastic.
So David Fales has been a career quarterback 3. He played quarterback 3 in Chicago. I think he also played in San Diego. I'm not confident, but he never ascended to number 2 on the depth chart. But it's like him and Josh Johnson, who is somehow still in the league, and Tom Savage. They all suck. Well, I mean, Fales has looked good in the preseason. I will say that, but they all generally suck.
Yeah, that's a thing. But they still get to hold it over. Over Green Bay since they were able to beat them and I believe sweep them last year. So let's talk Lions. They have a new tight end that they are very happy and proud of. Their little baby Gronk, which just turns my stomach every time I hear it. Yes, TJ Gronkinson. Let's go with that. What's new with the Lions?
Yeah, well, so they got a number of draft picks like every year, but the one that, like you said, is kind of fascinating to people is TJ Hawkinson, who I thought was the best tight end in the draft. A lot of people thought it was his teammate Noah Fant. I wanted to say TJ Fant. Noah Fant. Who is admittedly more athletic than him, but Hawkinson's more athletic than the rest of the class anyway. Hawkinson has been billed as the blocking tight end, while Fant is the receiving tight end, but Hawkinson did get more receiving yards and I believe touchdowns than Fant at Iowa last year. So he's clearly got a bit of receiving talent, and they tended to target him quite a bit. So in the preseason thus far, I think he only has 1 reception, but he has looked good as a run blocker. So that's something to kind of note. And then they also do have another rookie in Isaac Nada, who I believe went undrafted after just an abysmal combine. He looked pretty good at Georgia, though. Beyond that, I would say, you take a look at the Lions' offensive line situation. They obviously have Ricky Wagner and Taylor Decker, who they're very happy with. Frank Ragnow, who I think is playing center this year, who played guard last year, and Graham Glasgow, who is, I think, playing guard this year, played center last year. So far in the preseason, they've looked fine. Not like, well, I guess Ricky Wagner's got a really positive PFF grade now that I'm looking at it, but for the most part, they've been playing fine. It's kind of the backups that are concerning. They have a couple of second-year players, not just like Frank Ragnow, but they've also got Tyrell Crosby, the guy from Oregon. They've got just a bunch of young players. Bo Benschow is a rookie this year. Like I said, Graham Glasgow, who I believe is a second-year player. And just generally speaking, they've kind of struggled. So I think the backups will feast on the offensive line. But generally speaking, if we're just taking a look at the Lions kind of going forward, the biggest question on the offense is not, I mean, maybe it's Matthew Stafford's back, but it's not like running back where they've got Kerryon Johnson. It's not, starting wide receivers where they just had a couple of them return from injury. So they've got Marvin Jones, who just returned from injury, Kenny Golladay as a starter, Danny Amendola as a starter. Those are their three receivers. I would say all of them are above average for where they are on the depth chart. So Kenny Golladay is better than most receiver ones. Marvin Jones is way better than most receiver twos. Danny Amendola is better than most receiver threes, and that's great, but they don't have any resolution at backup among those receivers, which sounds very familiar. So that passing attack is very thin, right? So I would say they lose Hawkinson, they don't have any tight ends. They lose one of those receivers, the situation kind of drops off dramatically. I don't think they've got backup offensive linemen that they're super happy with. So it's kind of a thin offense that does have kind of a lot of potential. On defense, especially now that they've got some players returning from injury, and I think Deshaun Hand hasn't returned from injury yet, but they expect him to before the season. They've got an incredible defensive line. Trey Flowers, Mike Daniels, Damon Harrison, Deshaun Hand, those are the starters. I think they're pretty happy with Austin Bryant as a backup, Ray Smith as a backup. Just a bunch of, and Ashawn Robinson is not bad either. So just a really good rotation. I think Romeo Okwara is their primary backup defensive end. Really, really good, just generally speaking, on the defensive line, and that's kind of where they need to make hay. Because outside of Darius Slay, who is kind of a gambler at cornerback, so he'll allow big plays and he'll make big plays, I don't know that I love kind of what's happening with their secondary. Now, they're very excited about Will Harris, who I think is just coming off of a good game. But for the most part, there's worries about, the rookie Amani Warrior, who rotated with the ones early in camp and is no longer, I think, with the ones. He's kind of also a big play guy. There's worries at safety. They do have a former Viking in Justin Coleman. But, I think aside from like Quandre Diggs and I get, like I said, Darius Slay, not a ton in the secondary to be kind of happy with. And then at linebacker, it's a whole new crew from like 3 years ago. So the one I've been making fun of on Twitter is Jelani Tavai, who Lions fans got really interested in after I said he was the worst coverage linebacker in the draft. And then he had like a pick in camp. And so now he's great. Anyway, he's had a bad preseason in coverage. So I'm going to count that as a victory. Think they also have a very similar guy in Trey Lamar, who I want to say went undrafted from Clemson, but really the focus is on like Jalen Reeves-Maybin. I think Christian Jones, I think, is a primary backup. Devon Kennard, and it's just like it's a linebacker group that I don't say I would love, especially in coverage. So it's really, I think that defense is built from that defensive line out, and so that might be a concern for the Vikings, but just remember coverage matters a lot more, even for teams where you're going up against an offensive line that's not that great, because the offense still gets to dictate the pace of play, how often you pass, how often you run, or whether or not you have a moving pocket, whether or not you add an additional player in pass protection and so on. So, defensively, I think Lions fans think they upgraded more at defense than they actually did.
Yeah. And offense is still questionable at best. Let's wrap up our regular portion of the show before we hit the mailbag and talk about the kicking situation in Minnesota.
Yeah, I don't know. In my 53-man prediction, I had Corey Vedvik as both the punter and kicker, and presumably then Chad Beebe would be holding. But that's really just an exercise to see what that does. And that's how I got my 10th defensive lineman, Armin Watts, onto the squad. It does give you a little bit more flexibility because every roster spot's fairly precious. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Vikings have said it's a possibility, and I believe them that it's a possibility, but have signaled that they'd really rather that not be the case. Vedvik was not great at punting last week. And I think you take a look at his average punt and it's fine. But then you take a look at things like hang time, and that's pretty poor. You take a look at average return or net average, and that's really poor. And it's put into kind of a sharp contrast when you've got one of the best punters in the league, Michael Dixon, punting for the other team, and both are punting a lot. Dixon has a ton of hang time on his punts. And then Matt Weil had one punt at the very end, and it had tons of hang time. So I don't know that he's a great punter. At kicker, we didn't get to see a ton of field goal. We saw kickoffs, which is cool. We saw, I think, one kick. It was an extra point attempt. Would have been nice if the Vikings had kicked a 59-yarder at the end of the game instead of punting. With Matt Weil also, like, why? But yeah, I don't know that there is any resolution. It seems unlikely that they would trade a 5th-round pick for a guy they're going to cut and that 5 other teams wanted. But I don't know how they resolve this.
It is a bit of it's a bit of a concern, and the fact that there was such capital spent on it is why people don't usually do this sort of thing to begin with. But let's go to the mailbag. Let's cheer us up. Let's cheer us up at the mailbag. And Damian Barrett asks the question: with the NFC North shaping up to be a 3-way battle, do any of Arif's 50,000 spreadsheets give the correlation between tougher division and playoff/Super Bowl?
I wish I had an answer. This feels like something I should have had the answer to. I would say there's probably no correlation. I mean, you take a look at the Patriots, who've traditionally had a very weak division to get out of. They've won obviously a lot, and that would kind of complicate your results. Then after that, I mean, you could take a look at Pittsburgh, who has traditionally played, or Baltimore, who traditionally played in a very strong division. And they've won a fair amount in the NFC. When the NFC North has been strong, I think that's the only time Green Bay won, right? But, we've seen the Rams emerge from the shadow of a broken NFC West. And yeah, I mean, like the Seahawks were fine, but, the Cardinals sucked and it just, and the 49ers, they didn't have their quarterback. So I would say there's probably not much of a relationship just based off of the anecdata I just spewed forth. But yeah, it's probably worth testing.
All right. Also, he has to ask, tangential follow-up question: what is the most catastrophic MS Office failure you've ever had? As someone who used to write Excel macros for a living, there's nothing worse than seeing an Excel that will need to restart message, knowing you haven't hit save in a number of days. I'm
so happy that their autosave feature has gotten significantly faster and better, because I haven't had to deal with like a true panic in a couple of years. Like once, one of my auto recovers deleted for some reason, and that was very obnoxious. But the worst MS Office disaster had to be related to debate, where I had put together a 500-page file, which before I had saved, I had done about 250 pages of work, which is not 250 pages of typing, I should say, but it is still an equivalent amount of work. And I just had it up on my computer forever without saving, right, for over a week. And it just crashed. The assignment was due to the debate team like the next day. And me and my debate partner just like hunkered down, grabbed a bunch of Red Bulls and just worked overnight. I just missed classes the next day in order to get it done before the tournament. It was brutal. I can't explain how much despair and depression that caused. So thanks for bringing that up. It was
Arif's going to therapy.
Awful.
Christian Cooper asks, Pat Elfline, big problem or massive problem?
Big problem. I mean, like an interior offensive lineman. This is why I'm still a little upset about the Andre Dillard thing. Interior offensive lineman, not that important. It's a difficult sell for Vikings fans, I know. But tackle's just more important. And I think it's likely he plays better at guard than he did at center. He had just an awful game against, Poona Ford and whoever the Seattle defensive tackle was beside him. But, It's not that I don't expect. I expect it to get a little bit better. I think you're probably right that he's just not going to recover and be a good guard. But if you have one bad offensive lineman and the rest, and I think Josh Klein looks great. I think Garrett Bradbury has looked pretty good. Brian O'Neill looks a lot better. And Riley Reif, I'm not that concerned based off of his preseason play. A little bit concerned based off of camp, but maybe Everson Griffin's just good. Who knows? If you've got like one average-ish lineman in Reif and one bad lineman in Elflein, I think you're probably doing better than most of the league. So big problem, not massive problem.
Yeah. Next question is from Adam West, who asks, is it just me or has the way the team uses digs been extremely frustrating going back to last year? Always routes intentionally short of the sticks?
I asked PFF if this was like the case, if he was actually running shorter routes last year, because that was my complaint. That was what I thought had happened. And that's what happened. Laquan Treadwell had a higher average route depth than Stephon Diggs. Now, in terms of average depth of target, Diggs was actually more likely to be targeted on his deeper routes, except on the screens, on his deeper routes. So he actually had a comparable depth of target to Laquan Treadwell, just a little bit lower, but the average depth of route was a lot lower. And that's dumb because Treadwell is not a deep guy. Like, I don't know if you know this, but he's not like your deep speed guy. And so for Diggs to have a lower depth of target or depth of route is abysmal. This year, I think we're kind of conditioning ourselves to A, that previous fact, and B, the fact that both of his targets this year in preseason have come fairly short. But I will say, though he hasn't been running as deep as Thielen has been in camp, he has been on a bunch of deeper routes than we're used to seeing from him from last year in camp, and he's been winning on those routes. And he's done sideline deep stuff too. It's not as if he hasn't run deep. But, we've seen him run deeper in camp. So right now I'm not concerned. But, I'm aware that this could continue to be an issue.
Eddie asks, is the lack of rush in the preseason by the first team a threat to be an issue in the regular season, or is this more of a product of preseason effort and vanilla defense?
If the Vikings run the ball a lot, that's...
pass rush from the Vikings.
Well, then, no, I'm not concerned. I would say that Holmes, especially in week one, can provide you with an interior rush. If Shamar Stephen is the starter and he plays a significant amount of snaps, I'm back to kind of worrying about it because he just can't generate a pass rush. Whether or not Linval Joseph returned successfully from that shoulder surgery he had this offseason, and it was just released that he was suffering from a couple injuries last year, that will kind of define a lot of the interior pass rush because he's an unusually good pass rushing nose tackle, but he's had a down 2 years. So we'll kind of see about that. Everson Griffin, he didn't get a bunch of pass rush in this game. I'm not that concerned about it because he really does look like kind of his old self when you look at him in practice. So, we'll get kind of a good if he doesn't beat DJ Humphries like a drum, then let's talk about it. But I'm not that concerned that Daniil Hunter's look great. So I would say the lack of pass rush is not an enormous concern just because I think that we'll probably expect to see a lot out of Jalen Holmes. We're going to see a lot out of Daniil Hunter. And I personally anticipate, based off of watching Everson Griffin in practice, him to do well. So not concerned, but again, pretty aware that this could develop into an issue.
Raul asks, this week, Mike Jurecki tweeted evidence that 100-yard rushers win a higher percentage of games than 100-yard receivers or 300-yard passers. His detractors reply that correlation does not imply causation. What makes evidence for the passing game different?
So actually, that's a really good question. I thought it was just going to be respond to Mike Jurecki, which is like he knows what he's doing. That's fair. So correlation doesn't imply causation as a broad rule, but correlation in particular respects can imply causation if you treat it correctly when you're doing statistical work. And so one way to do that is to take a look at how predictive a measure is. And so you could look at first half of season, second half of season. You could take a look at random games. You could look at every alternate game or something like that. You could look at one season to the next season. And you can see, A, whether or not that statistic correlates with itself, so how stable it is, whether or not that statistic correlates with future wins, and so how predictive it is, which isn't to say it's necessarily causal, right? But, there's other ways that you can get to pointing to causality. You can't, and maybe this is a poor sentence by me because I didn't take statistics in college, but you can't prove causation, but you can very heavily suggest it. And if you take a look at stuff like, how many expected points do you get from the passing game? Well, you get this. This is how many expected points you get from the running game. Well, the more gains in expected points lead to points. And so that's kind of a causation argument. If you pass well in the first half, does it lead to passing well in the second half or predict passing well in the second half of a game? And does it lead to winning that game more often? And you kind of have to define your parameters for what it means to pass well. Total passing yards, not a great parameter. Passing efficiency, very good parameter. And so that tends to predict things better than rush success rate, total rushing yards per carry, DVOA, in all of these tests, in predicting future outcomes, half season, alternate games, and in predicting in-game kind of how you do. I did something last year when I was asking about, hey, the Vikings averaged like 9 yards a carry against the Patriots, but they didn't run the ball that much in the second half. Should they have run the ball more in the second half, even though they were down anywhere between 7 and 17 points? And I looked at whether or not running the ball well in the first half of a game by yards per carry correlated to running the ball well in the second half of a game. And I was like, well, okay, now let's take out big runs. If you quote unquote run the ball well because you had one like 80-yard run and the rest of your runs were bad, that's not a good measure. So I looked at that, and then I looked at success rate. And in game, it didn't even predict rushing success, much less predicting future points or wins. So there's a bunch of ways you can do it. But all of the ways that like statisticians and genuine statisticians, people with like PhDs and stuff like Eric Eager at Pro Football Focus, and people who work in data science for a living, there are a lot of ways that you can go about answering that question. Now, people will use this bludgeon, correlation doesn't imply causation, maybe a little too often. But I think that's actually a really good question to ask. Well, okay, then why do we think this other thing we think? And what does it mean for something to imply causation? How do you go about testing that? And the problem that they're getting at when they say correlation doesn't imply causation is that people are looking at same game results, and they're only looking at the conclusion. And so they provided an alternate explanation for why you compile so many rushing yards in a win. And it's because you're running out the clock. You run the ball more after you've begun winning. That's not the case for passing. Passing efficiency precedes win state or win probability, right? So people with higher passing efficiency end up 7 points ahead more often than people with higher rushing efficiency. And so you're not looking at the end state of the game. You're looking at, as the game evolves, which statistic best correlated to future gains. So there is a correlation aspect there, but it corrected for some of the problems where causation can run the other direction, because being up 7 points didn't make your passing game 5 minutes before you scored better. It's really much more likely to be the other way around. That was a very long answer, but I hope that helped.
Yeah. The professor asks, after seeing Andre Dillard's preseason performance, is it too early to say that we made a mistake in drafting Bradbury over him? Usually try not to be overreactionary, but it seems like we may have had a better pick and would fill a position we really need soon, which is the left tackle.
So I would say your reaction based off of 2 preseason games should be heavily biased by your opinion of that player before the draft, because how a player was drafted correlates better with their performance. I remember actually reading about it. I'm not just making this up. I remember reading about this. How where a player was drafted correlates better with their career performance than how they did in their first preseason. And so what you think of them before the draft should give you a better understanding. Now, if they were highly drafted and played well in the preseason, I would say that that's decent evidence that they're genuinely a good player. If they drafted if they were drafted highly and played poorly in the preseason, I would say that is not evidence of the opposite. Just to say that a good number of players who end up having good careers that were drafted highly had poor preseasons. But on the other end, if you had a good preseason, you're more likely to end up being good after you've already been considered good. Now, if you substitute draft position for your opinion of that player, I wouldn't be surprised if it had very similar kind of correlations. So the fact that Dillard has played well in the preseason, and I thought he was a stud, I think is decent evidence that he's going to end up being a pretty good tackle. The fact that Bradbury, who I was all right on, I didn't actually want to draft him in the first round, but he's a first round talented center, and he replaced a position of immediate need. Playing all right in the preseason, really good snaps, some really whatever, is not evidence that. So like my middling opinion plus his above middling performance in the preseason is not evidence that he's going to be good or bad. The most important thing to me is that a tackle is just much more important than a center in determining the outcomes to games. And I think it's because you can hide a center a lot better than you can hide a tackle. So actually, no, it's actually the reverse. Never mind. I think it's because your edge rush is going to provide more of a threat than the interior rush. That's it. Not the other one. So I would be concerned, but I wouldn't say, hey, 2 games in, the Vikings like made a mistake. I would just say, hey, some of the evidence is kind of suggesting the Vikings made a mistake.
Yeah. Next question from Matt Fries, who asks, what caused the botched snap, butt sweat? And why would you motion to empty and stay under center?
So I don't know what caused the botched snap. Maybe butt sweat. A team of investigators is on the case. As for the motioning to empty and staying under center, the reason you would do that is to maintain your timing. If you're in shotgun, it's a little bit more difficult to maintain. So you protect the quarterback a little bit better because they're a little bit further back. So you protect them from a pass protection standpoint. A lot of people think quarterbacks see the field a little bit better under shotgun. Some people disagree. You see the field better under center. I don't know where the Vikings stand on that. But primarily it helps your timing because your steps correlate with different parts of, the receiver, route depth. And so you get to your third step on a 3-step drop or your 5th step on a 5-step drop, and your first read is getting out of their break. You hitch a little bit, and your second read is getting out of their break. So it does kind of preserve the timing a little bit better. It's not just to threaten the run. And then I think also you stay under center, you motion someone out, that kind of reveals the coverage, which is great. But the passing concepts you wanted are still there. And maybe the motion is inaudible just for that running back. Who knows? If the audible is just for that running back to motion out to out wide, maybe it's because they're doing a box count and they see there's so many linebackers in the box, not good to run. So they move out wide and put another person to a pass pattern. And it might just be that, but everybody else gets to keep the assignment that they initially had, which would change maybe if they're under shotgun because the timing changes a little bit. So, those are reasons. I think it's funny. It looks hilarious to me. If I was running a football team, which is not a good idea, I should not be a coach. I would probably never be an empty under center, but there's reasons.
Christian B asks, I'm going to call the most entertaining question of the episode. What can possibly happen to make the Antonio Brown helmet situation even more bizarre and entertaining?
Man. If he just tries to sneak his old helmet into an actual game, that's, yeah.
I was thinking like colored Sharpies, like while he's on the field, like before like play, and like he just slowly makes more marks. Now it's what that's a black helmet, right, for the Raiders. Maybe he gets like the white Sharpie and just after he makes a catch, he just takes out a Sharpie and just one mark, and maybe they don't catch it right away, but like he slowly just marks up the helmet.
Kind of like
that he's
giving himself and it's a silver helmet. But you could put like black.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
But I like the idea that he gives himself like a Buckeye sticker, but in Sharpie every time he makes a play.
Yes.
That would be incredible. I still think sneaking his old helmet onto the field for an actual game would turn it up to 11. It'd be incredible.
Like I wore it out there and I didn't get a concussion. I was fine. Why is this weird?
What's wrong? I just...
He shows up to a pregame presser with just a bunch of like white powdered donut under his nose at that point. He's like, "No, I'm not being weird about this whole situation. I just want my old helmet." Is there something on my face?
I also like the idea of him just adding a bar to the face mask just every game of the season.
Yes.
That would be great too.
Or if he just goes like the old school kicker version and just has the one bar instead.
I think that's illegal, but we know that that's not stopping him. So go for it.
No, that is not stopping him. I think that's exactly what Antonio Brown needs to bring this up to 11. Is just the single bar out there. Or if he just starts playing with the actual like cage up.
Oh my god.
Instead.
So many.
Tackle me now. Be fantastic. Ian Pauley wants us to compare the receiving core to game day appetizers.
Man. So I know Stephon Diggs is probably wings, right?
I think you could make the argument that he'd be wings, but does that mean that Thielen ends up being nachos? Because you have the argument over which is the better game day thing, nachos or wings.
I think I was going to go Thielen nachos. I think Diggs has more potential because I think your wings can end up being really good, crispy, the collagen gelatinizes, and you've just got an incredible product. Got to get the right sauce, but fine. You got great wings. Nachos, I think, have a higher floor, right? Which I think is kind of Thielen-ish. And if you do it right, they end up being crazy spicy, which, Thielen has now yelled at 2 coaches. So on the sideline and his quarterback.
I was going to say, and Kirk Cousins famously.
I mean, there's that potential. I would say that both are generally considered just solid appetizers, at the top of their game, but not the top of the game, if you will. Just generally everyone recognizes them as being very good. The fundamentals are sound. It's kind of hard to screw them up, but, you can. So, I would say that, Thielen is nachos and Diggs is wings.
Does that put BB in the air of like mozzarella sticks?
Maybe. I think mozzarella sticks are maybe a little bit too good to be BB.
I do enjoy the image meme out there of do you want to eat 6 cheese sticks? No, God no. Why? What if we deep fry them and give you some marinara sauce? Hell yeah.
Yeah. That is how we treat that.
Potato skins?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I could see that. Or just like a solid dip, right? Like, you're not going to talk about the dip after a game. You might talk about the nachos. You might talk about the wings. You're not going to talk about the dip after a game. But it can surprise you.
You would. I was going to say you would if it surprised you and it didn't turned out to be excellent for that particular game. But otherwise, it ends up being a bit of an afterthought, sort of like the Laquan Treadwell of appetizers.
But it can be pretty forgettable. You can screw it up, and you can definitely have too much. So there's that. After that, like, I don't know. Zylstra's could be the what is that in a blanket? Right? Like, it's a stuffed something. We don't know. That could be really good. It could be pretty bad.
It's the Lutheran sushi thing where it's like the cold cut around the pickle and then there's like mayo involved or something.
I actually do like that.
You're a fan of the Lutheran sushi then. All right.
That just makes it seem worse.
I'm
college.
just because you like it doesn't mean it's a bad name. It's just you don't like it being called that because you feel that it shames you. I'm not necessarily shaming it. I'm just calling it what I've heard it called.
I think the wrong expectation. I'm going to say that it sets up the wrong expectations for people.
Is that what you're calling it now? Sure. And then Treadwell is the potato skins that were left in the oven a bit too long.
Yeah, I mean, I think Treadwell's like the cauliflower wings. It's very difficult to make them good. Somebody can do it, but they're not in your house.
they might not be allowed in your house anymore because they brought you the cauliflower wings the first time.
So yeah, I think he's the cauliflower wings. I've had good cauliflower wings. It's just pretty rare.
Kyle Segal asks, "Hi guys, long-time listener, first-time caller. Neither of these are I think long-time listener, but first-time caller definitely not. Wondering how one best expresses to their loved ones that they should really just keep their distance. They keep expressing concern and asking me to seek help. It's getting really annoying. I'll hang up and listen.
I suspect
Thanks."
Kyle doesn't actually have a turtle, and he's been pretending to have a turtle for years now. And his loved ones are saying, "Kyle, you don't have a turtle. This has become serious. You need to seek help." And he's like, "You're right. I do need help. Why won't he eat vegetables?"
Exactly. The last two things from Kyle, one was about how to get somebody to stop snoring, and now it's how do you tell them they need to keep their distance and go away from you. I want to do, if Kyle continues this, I'm just going to do like a special thing in the Christmas episode where like Kyle's messages to us are just combined into each one, and they all lead to. Yeah, exactly. All lead to his descent into madness, and later he'll be like a selfie from one of those like drying out facilities, Precious or whatever the rehab's called, Sands or something. He'll be at some resort like that, and like, no, I'm getting the help I need. Final question is from Slider6643. He says, "As a resident of New Jersey, I can legally bet on the Vikings. What should I place my money on for season prop bets?"
I would take the over on the wins, which I still think is at 9.5. They strike me as a 10.5 win team. And half is definitely very much in play.
I definitely think that. I think that sweeping the division is probably not something you could get off of that.
I guess I don't know what the prop bets are for season-long totals for the individual players. I would say probably take the over on Diggs. I'm probably the worst person to ask on Diggs because I'm just very optimistic about him generally. But whatever the season-long over for him might end up being, I would say take the over. I think Cook touchdowns, I would take the under. I think that there's a decent chance that the fullback plus Madison kind of takes some touchdowns away. So that's something I would kind of fade a little bit. I don't know what other prop bets there are. I would probably take...
Well, do you think Cousins over 4,000?
Yeah, I would do that. He's done it every year. He barely did it this year because he had his lowest yards per attempt, and they just threw the ball 600 some odd times. But I do think his yards per attempt will improve with the increase of play action, so I think he'll counterbalance the decrease in attempts. So I would take over 4,000.
Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Code. We will be back next week to talk about the final preseason football game. Arif, what do you have to plug?
Yeah, I've got a piece on an interesting wrinkle in the Vikings offense I'm going to write. I'm going to do a preview of the Arizona game that's going to be a little bit more in depth than what we saw on this podcast. Those will both be at The Athletic, which, by the way, day of recording, my 1-year anniversary of being employed at The Athletic.
Yay! That was a fun episode. That was a fun reveal that was done that day.
Yeah, it was. It was a ton of
good stuff. So that is going to be it for this episode. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will see you next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at Norse Code DN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.